and we're all happy you're here. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Well, go ahead.
Do you have any plans?
My buddy Martha and I are dressing up as Statler and Waldorf for Halloween, from the Muppets, yep. And we're gonna have our own little, socially isolated 2-person COVID party.
Nice, that's good. I'll probably dress up like Professor McGonagall, because I've got a good McGonagall costume for that. So I usually go between McGonagall or Doctor Who, so back and forth.
I was going to say, the first class I took with you, I think you dressed up as the 11th Doctor.
Yes, I probably did. Yes.
And I got to say, the 11th Doctor is my favorite Doctor.
Yep, I tell you. Although I have to say, the new Doctor's pretty cool, too.
She's great.
She's pretty awesome. So, yeah. But McGonagall's my good one. That's the one I really love to do. And the kids recognize, the little kids recognize her because everybody's a Harry Potter fan. So, but not everybody's a Doctor Who fan. So sometimes that goes over the neighborhood. But yeah, yeah, it'll be fun. It'll be good. This is like my favorite annual holiday. And a lot of it has to do because of Dia de los Muertos. And, my connection with Latin America. And so I love it. I love all aspects of it. So.
Yeah, it seems like a good, fun transition in the season for you.
Mm-hmm. It is. Because since I'm from Canada, American Thanksgiving has never really, it's never really been a big thing for me. Mm-hmm. We celebrate it obviously because I'm in the States and I'm married to an American and my kids are half and half. Mm-hmm. But to me, Thanksgiving was always in October because that's the end of the harvest season. So Canadian Thanksgiving is usually like the second weekend in October, and then Halloween and then Christmas. Okay. So this kind of Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas package is sometimes I feel a little overwhelming down here, but yeah.
I agree. Absolutely. When I first started actually doing the Christmas planning and the gifts and the Christmas cards and as well as the Thanksgiving and everything, it's too much. It's too expensive.
Yep, it's crazy. Yeah. I jokingly try to convince the students to get a movement to change the Thanksgiving American break to Canadian Thanksgiving because it's really mid-October that we need more than just a day off. If you could get that nice week in the middle of October and then, right, it doesn't seem so long, right?
Yeah, that's what CBCS does really well.
Yeah, they do actually. Yeah.
I want the CBCS schedule every 6 weeks, right?
I like that one. Yeah.
Get a week off. All right, it is 7:00, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening, the second in our History at Home series. This event is being recorded and will be made available on our website, crested-butte-museum.com, in a few days. So for any of your friends that are missing it, be sure to send them our way. Also, while you're at the crested-butte-museum.com website, please consider making a donation to support this program or consider becoming a member. Memberships help us keep the lights on and help us take care of over 18,000 artifacts that we have in our collection, as well as our exhibits and everything that we do. So thank you to everybody that has already supported us. It's gone a long way and we really appreciate it. Our walking tours are done for the season. We did extend them, and now it is officially too cold and too quiet to keep holding walking tours. However, they will pick up again in December, early December, and we're doing winter walking tours at 2 p.m. every Saturday. And that'll be through the whole winter except for holidays. You can always schedule a private historic walking tour for 3 or more people, and we kind of do it on your time when you're available and are interested in doing it. And that's a really good option, especially in these times when you may not want to join a full group of people. Thank you so much to Dr. Heather Thiessen-Reily for joining us this evening. Dr. Thiessen-Reily is a professor of history at Western Colorado University and teaches Latin American history. Before I hand it over to you, Heather, I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement. The museum recognizes that we are guests here on this land, historically Ute territory. We acknowledge that the mining and ranching community that established itself here at the end of the 1800s was at the expense of the Uncompahgre Ute and Tabawatch Ute, who were forcibly removed from this area due to the Bruneau Treaty and the manipulation that followed. We hope that you will take time to visit our neighbor, the Ute Museum, located in Montrose, Colorado, with exhibits developed in partnership with the Ute tribes by History Colorado, our state historic society. While we never could do this history justice, we do include information about Paleo Indians in the Gunnison Valley, the Ute people, the Bruneau Treaty, and the Los Pinos Indian Agency in our exhibits. The Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum knows that we have a great responsibility in representing many stories from our history, good and bad, and we continue to listen to those voices when they are ready to share. Thank you, everybody. Glow just said in the chat, we are still doing a walking tour this Saturday for the last one. So correction, we have one more cold walking tour this Saturday, 3 p.m., regularly scheduled. Thank you, Glow. And Dr. Heather Thiessen-Reily, I hand it off to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Now, I'd like to thank you and the Crested Butte Museum for inviting me to do this little talk about El Dia de los Muertos, which I was telling Nell is it accompanying with Halloween are two of my favorite celebrations of the year. And it's the time of year too when, you know, summer's come to an end. We've got, you know, the last walking tour of the museum. Harvest is underway. The aspens have lost their leaves. The air is cold. There's snow on the ground. And we're starting to feel that kind of chill in our bones, which only a fire in the hearth can seem to relieve. And the dark, cold days of winter loom. And to come to terms with that, we turn our clocks back an hour, and we tend to seek to focus on the positives of the change of season. Snow means moisture, and it also means skiing. Halloween trick and treat are definitely going to happen, and for some, the celebration of Dia de los Muertos is about to occur. And more we see elements of Dia de los Muertos in our own communities. Colorful skulls, dancing skeletons mix in with Halloween decorations. But what is Dia de los Muertos? Well, first, I tell you what it's not. It is not Mexican Halloween. The celebration of Dia de los Muertos is a combination of religious practices that date far back in time and which are celebrated in a festival which welcomes the souls of the dead back into the world of the living. For a few brief hours, once a year, the souls of the dead return to partake in the worldly pleasures they once knew. And these celebrations vary widely throughout Mexico, Central America, and now into the United States and Canada. And each community has its own character. And so their Dia de los Muertos celebration or Day of the Dead celebrations can often have a kind of unique element to them depending on what community is celebrating them. But wherever Dia de los Muertos is celebrated, it is the representation of the collision and interaction between two worlds. The pre-Columbian world of the Mexica, sometimes known as the Aztec, and that of the medieval Catholic world of Europe, in this case, Spain. Now, we often talk about the Spanish conquest of the Americas as if it was somehow a complete and total event. Through military and cultural dominance, the Spanish forced the indigenous peoples of the so-called New World to assimilate fully into European patterns of life and belief. But this is misleading. In many instances, indigenous peoples resisted assimilation, and in some cases, what occurred was a sharing and influencing of cultures that went both ways. This is the process we call acculturation, where two cultures, even if one is more dominant or powerful than the other, can still influence each other. And the celebration of Dia de los Muertos is a great example of the result of an acculturation process. The coming together of religious beliefs and practices of the two worlds, pre-Columbian and medieval Europe, that ultimately gave birth to something new. And so briefly, I want to speak about each of these worlds and the components that ultimately come together to form the Day of the Dead. In Europe, before the firm establishment of Christianity, many native religions commemorated the death of dearly departed relatives. The most influential of these rites was the ancient Celtic festival of fire known as Samhain. The celebration of Samhain took place primarily in the British Isles on the 31st of October, a particularly important date to the ancient Celts as it marked the end of their calendar year and the end of the harvest season. Samhain literally means summer's end. And perhaps befittingly, October 31st was also dedicated to the end of the human life cycle. It was believed that during Samhain, demons and witches roamed the streets, stealing children, destroying crops, and generally terrorizing the population. It was also believed that the spirits of dead loved ones visited their families in search of warmth and affection. And so large bonfires were lit to guide the spirits to their respective homes. And from this practice, Samhain became known as the Festival of Fire. We actually see this bonfire tradition being imported into the United States via Cajun culture in Louisiana. And to this day, on Christmas Eve, bonfires are lit in these communities. Now, Samhain was also considered a very auspicious day for prophesying the events of the new year. And in addition, adults would don costumes and go from house to house in their villages, requesting food or small presents. And the host would be assured a successful new year if he or she was generous to his or her masked guests. Pagan rituals like Samhain abounded throughout Europe, but as Christianity developed and spread, the church became concerned about the persistence of these pagan rites. In some cases, the Christian church sought to eradicate pagan ritual, but in other cases, it sought to co-opt and redefine pagan practice into a Christian form, as well as create new Christian holidays to attract followers to the faith. In 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV established All Hallow Mass to honor Christian saints and martyrs. And in 750 AD, then Pope Gregory took that celebration and moved it to November 1st, essentially appropriating the pagan Samhain festival. And this became known as All Saints' Day. Later in the 13th century, All Souls' Day was established on November 2nd. And All Souls' Day was set to specifically remember those souls of the Catholic faith who had passed away. Now, the medieval traditions regarding both All Saints and All Souls Days included the decoration of graves and cemeteries, all-night vigils, special church masses in honor of the dearly departed. Elements of the pagan festivals were also still practiced on those days. Tricks and pranks, costuming, offerings of food and drink. These traditions were generally prevalent in most of Europe and were extensively practiced in Spain. Spain was devoutly Catholic. It had been the center of the Counter-Reformation, so All Saints and All Souls' Day were widely celebrated there. And consequently, Spanish colonists and priests who traveled to the New World brought those customs of All Saints and All Souls' Day with them. So we'll leave medieval Europe and we're going to travel over to the New World prior to the arrival of Columbus in the Caribbean. And this is to pre-Columbian Mexico. Now, in the case of Mexico, before the arrival of the Spanish, Mexican indigenous practices centered on the relationship of life, death, and resurrection. They were all seen as important elements in a continuous cycle of humanity, and Mexica religious organizations were dedicated to the dead. For the Mexica, death was personified in and worshipped as a deity known as Mictlantecuhtli, who resided in Mictlan, their underworld. He was portrayed as a skeleton with a protruding tongue in the form of a sacrificial blade, and all those who were not fortunate enough to die in battle, in childbirth, or by drowning became the subjects of Mictlantecuhtli. Much like Hades in Greek mythology, the soul's journey to Mictlan was arduous. The soul was required to cross 8 rivers and travel through 8 hells. At one point, the soul had to cross a desert with winds that cut like obsidian knives, an obstacle that no mortal could survive. And eventually, the soul would reach its final resting place of Mictlan. So in addition to this Mexica concept of the underworld and their god Mictlantecuhtli, we also have within the Aztec calendar, the Mexica calendar, 2 months that were specifically organized around honoring the dead. In the 9th month of the calendar, a series of days were dedicated to honoring children who had died. Flowers were offered, idols were decorated, and all was accompanied by singing, dancing, and human sacrifice. This smaller festival, honoring dead children, prepared the populace for the following month celebration in the 10th month, honoring dead adults. Small breads made from amaranth grain mixed with a bit of human blood were blessed and consumed as part of the rituals. And so here we have 2 cultures, medieval Europe and Mexica in what is today Mexico, developing cultural and religious beliefs and practices around honoring the dead. As a result of the Spanish conquest and the arrival of Catholicism in Mexico, we see clear attempts by the Spanish to eradicate Mexica religious practices. But these 2 Mexica celebrations of the dead continued. Over time, Mexican Catholicism emerged. And Mexican Catholicism sort of works on multiple levels. We have the kind of within it, the more formal, traditional, institutional Catholicism, but we also have developing a kind of folk religion, which allowed for the continuation and reframing of pre-Columbian beliefs and practices within a Catholic framework. And this acculturation of Mexica and Spanish celebrations are what resulted in Dia de los Muertos. In Mexico, November 1st of All Saints' Day became dedicated to departed children, the angelitos, little angels. And on November 2nd, All Souls' Day, Dia de los Muertos was established, which was dedicated to all departed adults. So as I mentioned, Day of the Dead celebrations vary widely. In urban centers, the festival can be a bright, joyous, really raucous affair with parades and costuming, and it's open to tourists and locals alike. The marketplaces are filled with special toys of paper mache, candies, or what we call alfaniques. You can see them up in the top corner. These are the little sugar skulls, all skulls that represent candles, little statuettes. There's papel picado. These are the paper cutouts you can see that are strung across streets and within houses and in neighborhoods. And these are all kind of cut or created in the shape of skeletons, or what we call calaveras, which I'll talk about a little later. Also on sale in these marketplaces will be cempasúchil, which is a small, bright orange-yellow flower, very similar to our marigolds, as well as mano de león, or what we would call purple coxcomb. There's pan de muertos, pan of the dead, bread of the dead, candles, and copal, incense, which is a type of resin that has been used in religious ceremonies dating back all the way to the pre-Columbian era. And so all these sort of elements come together to make up Day of the Dead celebrations. In the smaller communities, though, the markets will offer similar items, but the ceremonies are often simpler and quieter, more personal, traditional. The festival is more of a family affair, with the majority of the celebrations occurring within the family home. But urban or rural, intimate or open, the festivities all generally follow the same pattern. In anticipation of the arrival of the spirits of their dead relatives, families construct special altars in their homes known as ofrendas. Many anthropologists believe that the private celebrations of Dia de los Muertos in the home, which include the creation of these ofrendas, are really more related to pre-Columbian traditions than to medieval European ones. The altars are decorated with photographs of the departed, statues of famous saints, favorite foods of the deceased, chocolate, fruits, cerveza, the best tequila, pan de muertos, toys for children, and of course, decorated sugar skulls with the name of the deceased painted on the forehead. The pungent smell of burning copal incense mixes with the strong perfume of the cempasúchil flowers to pull the souls to the altar. The petals of cempasúchil are strewn on the altar, but they're also used to construct paths from the altar through the door, out through the house, and down the road in the direction of the cemetery. And these petal paths are important because they ensure that the dead not only find their way to their altar, but also back to the cemetery. Because if a soul gets lost and doesn't get back to the cemetery, he or she might remain in the world to trouble the living, and we cannot have that. In the evening, families gather in local graveyards all night to visit with the souls. Graves are decorated with candles, cempasúchil, and food. And sometimes bands are there to play music to gladden the heart of the departed. Food is also laid out in the churches for souls who have no family to welcome them. Now, the dead don't actually eat and drink the offerings, but rather they absorb the essence of the food and drink. And after the dead have had their fill, the family partakes in the feast, and later, once the souls have returned to the afterlife, the offering is distributed amongst relatives and friends. Church services are also an extremely part of the celebration, and the activities in the cemeteries and the churches generally are more influenced by the medieval European Catholic traditions that were brought by the early Spanish settlers to Mexico. Now, through all of this, there is a great percentage of the festival that has a kind of lighthearted, mocking edge to it. We see during this time in Mexico a lot of satirical death advertisements, mock obituaries, cartoons that are loaded with political commentary, a lot of humorous poetry is circulated, and really anyone can be the object of a good-natured, if not pointed, teasing. And the figure who features most prominently in such activity is the image that we most associate with Dia de los Muertos, and that's the skeleton. Now, the skull was always an important symbol of death and sacrifice in Mexica culture. We also know that carved skeletons were often used in medieval and colonial religious parades in Europe. And so the importance of the skeleton is represented in both Mexica and European religious practices. And so when we have these practices come together in Mexico, the skeleton becomes kind of a center point for this celebration. Around the 18th century, we start to see representations of death as kind of in very satirical forms. Increasingly, death is sort of represented in a kind of comical skeleton. And these representations really came from the popular classes. And during Dia de los Muertos, this is a time where the drama and tragedy of everyday life can be momentarily forgotten. And for 2 to 3 days of the festival, people will embrace this more friendly, amusing, caustic-tongued, mischievous death that's represented by the skeleton. Puppets and masks, figures made of clay and cardboard, toys and candies such as the sugar skulls, the pan de muertos, they all begin to fill Mexico's popular markets with the image of the skull and the shape of the skeleton. And all of them are collectively known as calaveras. Now, to a large extent, the 20th century sort of popularity of the representation of the human skeleton was really due to one individual in Mexico, and that was Jose Guadalupe Posada. Posada was an engraver and artist who did his most famous work during the late 19th century in Mexico City. I apologize for that. Under the regime of the dictator Porfirio Diaz. Posada provided cartoon illustrations to many popular tabloids or gazettes which were specifically geared towards the masses. His illustrations in many cases were satirical commentaries on the events of the era, All elements of society, particularly the Mexican upper class and the government officials, were satirized by Posada's skeletons. And he did much to popularize the calavera, not just through his political cartoons, but also depicting them as dancing, drinking, riding bicycles, doing all the things that we living folk did. And I've put some of his more famous examples up here on this slide. You know, for the majority of Mexicans living under political repression and tremendous social inequality of the Porfiriato in the late 19th, early 20th century, death could be portrayed as the great, albeit humorous, equalizer of socioeconomic injustice. The skeleton image was an effective vehicle for social and political criticism of the government, of Mexican society, and its elites. And even today, the calavera still plays these roles, and of course has become the most distinctive image associated with Dia de los Muertos. One of the examples I have up here on the screen is an example of these kind of funny, sort of humorous, but very satirical poems that are written and then widely circulated. This one comes from the era of Posada. It's called The American Mosquito. And it's kind of the Mexican take on all these Americans coming down into Mexico, and that how pesky they are. And these things are often, so they're often vehicles for social criticism that don't necessarily bring the negative attention of the authorities down on you, because of course it's not Mexicans who are saying this, right? It's the calaveras, and who can control a calavera? They just do what they want to do. So today, in some parts, today in Mexico, Dia de los Muertos is a tradition that is rapidly changing. The festivals in some parts of Mexico attract many tourists. In fact, there are, in Mexico City, the celebrations are so fantastic, and the parades and the costuming is so over the top that it's actually become a time in which people like to visit Mexico City just to sort of be part of that and to see it. In the United States, too, we've seen the spread of Dia de los Muertos expanding far beyond the Mexican-American population. And we see as well the full-scale commercialization of the celebration, right? Coffee cups, T-shirts, tattoos. The calavera image is become very, very popular, to the point where it is really integrating into our Halloween decorations and celebrations. A lot of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, though, have great concern about the commercialization and kind of the globalization of Dia de los Muertos. And it's not surprising, you know, part of this is connected to discussions of cultural appropriation, people adopting images and practices without really understanding their history and where they came from. So it's important to remember that for many, Dia de los Muertos is an important part of cultural expression and survival. We see forms of Dia de los Muertos in both secular and religious artistic expression. But in many cases, those are still coming from the Mexican and Mexican-American community. And so I think it's really important for us, and I appreciate you tuning in tonight, to learn about the history of this celebration. Because it is a form of cultural expression, but also survival. Elements dating back to pre-conquest Mexico are still with us to this day. Dia de los Muertos, then, is a celebration which represents the unique blending of traditions from ancient pre-Columbian peoples and medieval Catholic ceremonies. It's not simply Mexican Halloween, and people who celebrate it are continuing the traditions of two cultures which collided in often painful and violent ways, leaving a complicated legacy of contact which is still playing out today. And so to leave you, I would like to just quote from Octavio Paz here, who has his Labyrinth of Solitude, which is kind of a classic philosophical examination of the Mexican character, dating back to, I think, the 1950s. In this work, Octavio Paz writes, "To the people of New York, Paris, or London, death is a word that is never pronounced because it burns the lips. The Mexican, however, frequents it, jokes about it, caresses it, sleeps with it, celebrates it. It is one of his favorite toys and most steadfast love. Of course, in his attitude, perhaps there is as much fear as there is one of the others. At least he does not hide it. He confronts it face to face with patient disdain or irony." And so Dia de los Muertos defines death in terms of life and implies that our deaths can illuminate our lives and that perhaps goodbye is not forever. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. So for folks, if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll be sure to make time for those. Heather, I mentioned this to you before, but it is really amazing how one artist can have such an immense impact on not only the representation of that, but when we think of, or for me anyways, when I think of Dia de los Muertos, all that artwork by Posada really stands out. That's what I think of. So what you mentioned, that the political aspect that he was taking on, was that really what drove that to be such a domineering symbol of that event?
I think it's a combination of the fact that you already have kind of the skeleton, the calavera, already existing within both Spanish and Mexica indigenous societies. And then also, because Dia de los Muertos really is kind of a celebration of death and life, not just the political role that Posada's calaveras played, but also the fun role. I mean, he's got, if you do a Google search on Posada calaveras, you'll see scenes of them drinking and fighting and bullfighting and riding bicycles and kind of doing all this sort of thing that I think humanizes death. It also makes death a little less scary, right? And so because death is inevitable, why should we fear it, right? And so Posada's popularization of that kind of, humorous death skeleton, I think actually probably is more influential than even the use of the skeleton for political reasons. But both are still used to this day. I mean, in some ways, Dia de los Muertos has a little bit of European carnival about it. Carnival was always that time where the lower classes, the peasants, could actually critique and complain about the elites. It was like they couldn't be held responsible for that. And so we see this as well. And so that's, I think there's that element of it as well that comes in from a European tradition. Yeah, somebody just posted that they're in Tucson, and yeah, that's on my bucket list actually to go and see the Dia de los Muertos. Have I attended one? Yeah, I've attended a couple. I've attended one in New Mexico, and then I've also attended one in northern Guatemala, just south of the Mexican border, where we have a lot of the Maya sort of. They don't really see except the border. You've got Maya in southern Mexico and Maya in northern Mexico, and so these ones were very small though, and they were much more Spanish. I was living with a family in Huehuetenango, and so for the Dia de los Muertos there, because Huehuetenango is not a big tourist destination, they did the altar in the home. We went to mass, we went to the graveyard, cleaned the graves. And then the next day on All Souls Day, we actually all went out and flew kites. And they talked about how kind of the flying the kites was this sort of connection between heaven and earth and the afterlife. So that was a very unique way of celebrating the 2 days.
It's interesting, this idea of celebrating death. And as you sip out of your cup, that also reminds me that you have a background in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, do you see any parallels between the celebration of death in New Orleans and then also Dia de los Muertos?
Yeah, I mean, New Orleans is a Catholic city, right? It was Spanish, it was French, and All Saints and All Souls Day are big celebrations there. My husband's family is from New Orleans. One side of it's Catholic, so on All Saints and All Souls Day, whenever we were in New Orleans, we would go to the above ground cemeteries, and we would clean the graves, bring flowers, and do that. So that Catholic tradition is very, very strong. And then, of course, I mentioned the Cajun tradition. Oh, somebody asked about my pin. Yeah, I wore this in honor of tonight because this is based on one of Posada's his calaveras, the little calavera riding a old-style 19th century bicycle. I wore it just in honor. I got it in Mexico City years ago.
That is so fun. You during our practice, you had mentioned that you're working on another project now. What is that? Could you remind us?
Yeah. So I'm working on an environmental history of a historic ranch that the U.S.-Mexican border now cuts through. It was the San Bernardino land grant. It remained sort of the land was granted, but it remained unpopulated because the Apache were very active in that area. Ultimately, it ends up getting sold to an American, very well known. If you're from Tucson, you may recognize John Slaughter's name. It becomes the Slaughter Ranch. And the U.S.-Mexican border was cut right through it. And so I'm doing an environmental history about that ranch. Today, it's on the American side, or the U.S. side, it's a combination of it's a state park, it's a historic slaughter ranch, right? And then part of it is also a wildlife refuge that's managed by the Arizona Fish and Wildlife. On the Mexican side, it's owned by an American woman who is restoring the desert through some really amazing work with local communities there. And then, of course, unfortunately, the area of the border I was just down there in March, and it's been totally, the wildlife refuge has been totally torn up with the construction of the border wall. And so we're seeing a lot of really serious environmental damage to the wildlife preserve that folks are really concerned about. So I'm working on this kind of large environmental history, looking at this ranch and examining public and private partnerships and environmental initiatives. And I'm very excited about that. I'm on sabbatical next spring and going to spend 100% of my time working on that project.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
that is going to be fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Heather, for being here tonight. Do you have any last things that you'd like to say or wrap up about?
I just really appreciate the comments that people put in the chat. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I teach Latin American history, and 400 miles or so are the border wall. Yeah, and through some of the most pristine and unique environment, ecosystems that we have. It's I've got a friend who's down in Big Bend right now, and they're really concerned about the impact of it down there. So but I teach Latin American and African history and borderlands history, so if anybody's ever interested in taking a class at Western or needs a guest speaker, I'd be happy to oblige.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. That's so great. Before everybody goes, I want to let everybody know next week we've got Donald Tucker, or Tuck as most people know him, and he's giving a history of fur trapping in the West, and also talking about his own personal stories as a mountain man, and he's got all of his homemade gear that he shows off as well. So be sure to join us next week and tell your friends. Also remember, visit CrestedButteMuseum.com to become a member or to make a donation to support this program and all the work that we do here. Thank you again, Heather. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a good night, everybody, and happy Halloween and Felices Dia de los Muertos.
All right. Bye, everybody.